The coronavirus has hit all of us hard, some of us more than others. For today, tens of thousands of people across the nation are grieving the loss of a loved one. Could be a spouse or a friend, could be a child or a brother, could be a parent or a neighbor or a coworker. Regardless, the grief has hit us in the midst of the social isolation, making our grief even harder. Because where do you go? Where do you turn to? There's no group of people that you can run to, no person that can hug you, no gathering of the family or church. There's no wake or funeral. And perhaps you weren't even able to be there when your loved one died. What do you do? How do you make it through? Pivot Family Foundation has produced this series of videos of experts in the field of grief and bereavement to give tips and guidance and wisdom to help you navigate this season, and to remind you of something very simple but very powerful. You are not alone. Though you may feel like you are, you're not. There are people who are with you and who are for you. So thanks for watching, and find encouragement in the days ahead. Hi, everyone. I want to take a moment to welcome Rob Zucker. Rob is a grief counselor and writer and a consultant, teacher, and speaker, specializing in the area of grief and loss, and he's been doing this for 30 years. Rob leads seminars, workshops, and retreats for hospitals and hospices around the nation and even Canada. He's an avid writer on this topic of grief, including care notes with Abbey Press, numerous care notes actually with Abbey Press, and also has written a book called The Journey Through Grief and Loss, Helping Yourself and Your Child When Grief is Shared. Rob, we are delighted to have you as a part of our conversation and part of our series on grief during this time of the coronavirus. So welcome.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm really happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Fabulous. We are in the midst of a coronavirus and quarantine, and in the midst of all that, we're having people that are going through grief and loss because of a loved one who has died. We've had, or you've talked about similar situations on a more smaller scale, nothing global like we're going through right now. But you've talked about a couple of situations previously where it was, like I said, a smaller scale. Hey, talk to us about those for just a moment.
Sure. Well, when thinking about how this time when we have a loved one who dies, how we really restrained from traditional rituals, and we can't often even get into a hospital if it's a death where someone's hospitalized previously to the death. We can't be with our loved one at the time of death, and we can't also participate in funerals very often, or at least at this point, no one is. And we're really having to really restructure our sense of what grief is about, and so how to get support and how to take care of ourselves. And so I was thinking about a number of years back. I was working in a large hospital center. I was directing a bereavement counseling program, and I met a woman in the emergency room after she was surviving a survivor of a terrible car accident. And was actually driving to she and her husband and children were driving in a car to a new location where they were relocating their lives, moving to a new place.
Oh, wow.
And en route on one of the major highways, they got into an accident, and the husband and one of the children were killed in the car. And she was very, very seriously injured. So I met her during her recovery, first in the emergency room and then in the hospital. And she had all sorts of challenges in terms of processing this these traumatic losses in her life, and was strained physically because she was unable to get out of bed to attend the funerals of her child and also her husband. She had limited ability to support her surviving children. And she had many limitations she was facing, and the trauma of the these deaths, which were violent in nature in terms of the suddenness and the physical damage and the two who died, had terrible imagery, and she had many different pieces to a trauma, and the inability to go to the funerals, I think, was one aspect of her experience that stands out for me when I reflect on it, and how she had to really figure out another form of commemorating these two people in her life that she loved so dearly, without having to, not being there, without being with her family, without receiving the kind of community of support the way we normally would. So when I think about now, I think there's a parallel. We also talked about how we have expectations of how we grieve our loved ones, and we talked about earlier. You and I talked about 9/11 and how one of the issues that came up for so many people back then had to do with when a loved one that was killed in the towers. Often the body was for long periods of time never identified. Sometimes DNA would confirm a death sometimes months later, and people proceeded often with funerals without body, and that was a very disorienting and disruptive kind of challenge for people to have to kind of go forward with the commemoration, but not in the way that they would have liked to, or would have expected to be able to do.
Yeah, and as you were talking, that sounded terribly traumatic almost for the survivors.
Oh yeah, I think there's an element of trauma, and I think there's a element of post-traumatic stress that occurs that complicates the grief experience for people whose expectations are so dramatically disrupted.
Yeah, and so that means that because we don't ever get over loss or anything like that, but it sounds to me that people need to realize it will take longer to move through the grief. Is that a correct assumption to make on this?
Well, I hate to make a prediction in terms of how people grieve, because everyone's so unique. But we could say, and maybe we could generalize that way and say there are some more obstacles in the way.
Okay.
Maybe different challenges that could perhaps prolong the grief.
Yeah. So what would some of those challenges be that people may not be aware of?
Well, I think that there are additional losses. The loss of not being able to attend a funeral is another grief, another loss we grieve for.
Right.
Not being able to, not being able to do the things we want desperately to do, but can't do. I think that there are compounded losses that complicate the grief.
Yeah, and so it's harder to get over, or not get over, but get through that season of grief.
Yeah. I think one thing we can do is to identify, well, what have we lost here? And I think we often talk about secondary losses with grievers. We lose the personhood, but we also lose the relationship. And there are so many dimensions, and we lose our sense of who we are in relation to the person that died. So all those are factors that complicate, or maybe we say deepen the sense of loss for a person. And this is another factor that I was denied what I needed at the time of my loss, which is a new loss in and of itself. So I think we might say it lengthens or deepens the aspect of what we're grieving for. Right.
And I think the awareness of that alleviates some of the stress, perhaps, to like, okay, this grief is different than others, but it's also normal, so to speak, because of these complicating factors.
There's a notion of ambiguous loss, loss that's kind of it's hard to define it. Pauline Boss is a psychologist who wrote about that in a book called Ambiguous Loss. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. There's something that's clear cut. So-and-so, this person who I love died. But there are other less easily defined dimensions to our grief. And often, I think when we're denied ritual, we have an ambiguity about what do I feel uh, the way I do beyond the death of this person who I love, but there's something else. It has to do, maybe it emerges with anger or regret or
Mhm.
sense of failure. I couldn't do what I should have done. I
Mhm.
should have been there at the funeral, but I couldn't.
Mhm.
How do we interpret that? And sometimes we turn it onto ourselves. I
Mhm.
failed here. And I
Mhm.
think that's another potential dimension to this experience.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if people that lose someone will feel like they failed because they didn't protect their loved one from this virus.
Yeah, yeah. That's one dimension, and also I failed because I did. Maybe I could have insisted that I go into the hospital with my loved one. Maybe
Right.
there's something I could have done that could have, enabled me to get in, but I didn't.
Mm.
Somehow it must have been my fault. So
Mhm.
yeah, and it did I in fact introduce the virus through my own illness.
Oh yeah.
That's the dimension. Sometimes there's a reality to that I had a role to play, and learning to understand that and come to terms with that is another challenge, perhaps.
Yeah. Which leads me to wonder about the value and the importance of needing to forgive ourselves if we do make mistakes or things aren't correctly carried out as we were instructed to.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes I think that we have to kind of face the reality that we did. Hopefully, we can say I did everything I could have done, yet uh, nevertheless, uh, I contributed to this tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Or we might have to say, I did everything I thought I needed to do in my understanding of the circumstances, and now I'm realizing that maybe I could have done more. How do I um, come to terms with that? Is it possible to forgive myself for my failure here? Uh, what was and often what I think helps us temper that is that remembering that our intentions were good, and
Mm-hmm.
from how we understood the world, we did the best that we thought we should do.
Right.
Sometimes later we learned, and there was a lot of misinformation, and there always still is now a lot of confusion, a
Right.
lot of mixed messages, a lot of misinterpretations, and of what is going on, and that was it has been kind of throughout this whole process.
Yeah.
What news media do you listen to? What resource do
Yeah.
you turn to? Who do you believe? Who do you trust? So we make decisions given our circumstances, and then sometimes we bump into what we wish we had done differently.
Right.
And I think that's a very important process. And I think friends, family, clinicians, clergy can help us begin to examine that
Mm.
and eventually, hopefully, come to terms with it and own what we believe we need to own,
Mm-hmm.
and also forgive ourselves or embrace who we are and move forward in some way.
Yeah.
And that's not
Well,
easy. It's simple to say it, but it's not easy to
yeah.
experience and do it.
Yeah. Sometimes some of that has to be worked through over time. And so we say, hey, forgive yourself. Well, that doesn't happen like today. It's like every day you wake up with the reality, okay, today I'm forgiving myself and I'm moving forward, or I'm letting go of the anger or whatever, because there's a lot of
Yeah,
that emotion underneath the grief or
yeah,
comes from it maybe. Maybe the grief is the underlying part of it.
yeah. I know I can relate to one of my most challenging traumas in my life. It was discovering that my children were abused in daycare,
Oh,
and and uh, and I think that it resonates in some way with what we're discussing
mm,
because these are my most sacred, beloved people. These two precious children were very young at the time, and realizing that I had to eventually realize over time, as you say, begin to look at how to process my anger, not just at others who were, the perpetrators, but also anger ultimately at myself for not
mhm,
realizing how to protect my children, what I needed to do.
right,
So eventually. it often comes down to, I think anger often is a way of expressing our despair and our regret and our and the circumstances many often we have no control over.
Mhm.
And ultimately, for me, I found that the anger was externalized and eventually internalized for me.
Mhm.
And it was a very dark time in my life
Mhm.
when I came to grips with how I failed my kids,
Mhm.
not deliberately, but how whether I should have magically known or whether the things I could have done differently if I had seen what was going on in a different light. And so, kind of bringing that home, so to speak,
Mhm.
and then learning how what we need to do. What does it mean to hold on to some truth that we could have done better?
Uh-huh.
And that's, it's a tough, maybe for some it's a lifelong process of understanding our limitations and validating our intentions as being having been good.
Right. Thanks for watching this episode. I'm glad you found some encouragement and guidance and wisdom to get you through this season of life. This coronavirus will one day end, so will the quarantine, and you'll be able to reconnect with family and friends and to find some healing from that personal touch of being with them. You can't change the past, it's permanent and it's gone, but you can choose a new future. You can choose to move forward in your life, which is what you've actually done by watching this video. You've taken a step to find healing even in the midst of social isolation. So congratulations to you. I hope you will share this video with others and help them find the encouragement and healing that they need to. Thanks so much.